Inhale, exhale. Time to take a deep breath. We'll get into everything that's happened over the course of the past week, especially those two public hearings that took place, including everybody's favorite, if you will, on everybody's favorite topic, weed. We will get to all of that momentarily. First, just to let folks know, if you guys want to participate in Q&A, we do a live Q&A with your commentary. That's your opportunity to access the show. Put your questions and comments into the comment section now, and we will get to the Q&A at the end of the show. Just remember to just go ahead and shoot out that commentary before you lose track of it while it's on your mind. Also, as a reminder to everyone, I am trying to allow this show to become something of a call-in show. So if you'd like to call in, that's the way you can do it. Go on to Discord. That's the invite link. Go on to discord.com and type in that invite link. Get into my channel. I have the channel open up on this screen for those of you at the end of the show who want to participate via call-in. There's also a lot to get into today, and there's going to be some topics that we're going to be covering only on YouTube. So when the show ends, after we do our Q&A, hop onto YouTube. I'm going to be disconnecting from Facebook because there's some topics I want to cover that have to do with the word election that I don't know if I can cover even on YouTube. But if I'm going to get booted off of one publication, I'm only going to get booted off of one and not both. So we'll be killing the Facebook stream after about an hour or so when we get through the rest of the topics of the show, which, as I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get the show into a position where we start off as we have the last few episodes of the show with some good news. And what better place to start than, of course, Mayor Pete Bass's Facebook page, where we have news from the high school field hockey team, who was recently the runner-up at the CIAC Class M State Championship. The Green Wave did not win today's championship. The New Milford High School varsity field hockey team, Coach Huff, staff, and parents had a great season. Congratulations on placing runner-up in the State Class M Championship. We are all very proud of you. Go Green Wave, New Milford, proud and strong. Continuing with that strong field hockey tradition over at New Milford High School. So congratulations to them. Always great to start off the show with some good news. Today's news is not really going to be necessarily like last week, where it was just nonstop blackpilling and nonstop, if you want to call it bad news. Today's news is going to be more of just news. It's just going to be what happened, what took place. We're going to get into why, and we're going to get into my thoughts on the matter, of course, after we get through the what took place. So more importantly than anything, what took place was these two public hearings, which were ahead of last week's town council meeting. You guys can check that on in your own time. All you have to do is, like I've done here, go to YouTube, type in Town of New Milford, and the first thing that's going to show up is the Town of New Milford YouTube channel. And then below that are the two public hearings, which you can see. One is for the proposed hot work permit ordinance, and one was for the proposed cannabis ordinance. So the best way to get information on that, other than this show, if you want to see everything from the various horses' mouth, I don't know what the plural of horse is. I think it's just horse. I think the plural possessive of horse is just horse's mouth. Anyways, if you want to hear it from the horse's mouth, that's the place to go. Just go onto YouTube, type in Town of New Milford. It'll be the first two things that show up. And the main reason that we're going to be starting off with the cannabis ordinance is, aside from the fact that that's what you guys are here for. That's what you guys want to hear about. That's what you guys want to talk about. That's the place where there's some confusion. The real reason I want to go into this is because this is the place where there's lots of misinformation. It's not disinformation. It's not people lying to you. It's not people purposely trying to persuade people into a certain position. It's just that there's a lot of incorrect information that's being thrown out there. So the first place we're going to start is what is taking place here. And what we can do is we can actually read the entire ordinance, which is only a page long. It's like 4 sentences long. In fact, that's what I did during the entirety of my commentary, because I went up to public comment at the public hearing. I was there, and I actually spoke during public comment during the public hearing. And you can see, and this is going to be about a minute and a half of commentary with a question towards the end of it, where you guys can hear the entire ordinance, because it was nice and short and sweet. All right, Mike Sennello, 111 Willow Springs. The ordinance is nice and short and sweet, so I would just like to please read it into the record if you guys don't mind. I'll read the whole thing since it's only like 4 sentences. 2C1, definitions, cannabis, marijuana, and vaping, as used in this chapter, shall have the same meaning as stated in Public Act 21-1, the so-called, quote, responsible and equitable regulation of adult use cannabis act, end quote. Section 2C-2, where cannabis use is prohibited, smoking and vaping of cannabis and any derivative thereof in any form or in any municipally owned or leased property is prohibited. Subsection 2C-3, any person who violates the provisions of this ordinance shall be subject to a fine of $250. That way, at least everyone at home who's watching has an idea of what the ordinance is that we're talking about. And since it's so nice and short and sweet, I can read the whole thing. Just very briefly, I hope the next time the council is in session to discuss this, they ask the attorney, what constitutes municipally owned or leased property, especially as it relates to the municipally owned roads? So does this apply to passengers in a vehicle? Does this apply to two neighbors who are adults and don't have kids in the house at the end of a cul-de-sac at night after everyone's gone to bed, popping up chairs at the end of their cul-de-sac and watching the stars? So not a complaint, just a question. Love to hear the answer from the attorney when that time comes. And we did get an answer. We'll get to that momentarily. The very quick answer in a word is no, it does not apply. Is no, it does not apply to the road. We'll get into that in just a moment. But again, since we're focusing on the what for now, for those of you who couldn't follow along all that easily with what I was saying, that's the ordinance right there. I'll drop a link in the comments right now so you guys can follow along. That's the entire ordinance. It's 1 page long. There we go. It's 1 page long, and it's just a few sentences. We can probably zoom in on this and just read it again real quick so you guys can see it. If you want us to pause the video and screenshot it and review it, there you can. Section 2C-1, cannabis, marijuana, and vaping, as used in this chapter, shall have the same meaning as stated in Public Act 21-1, the so-called Responsible and Equitable Regulation of Adult Use Cannabis Act, which is almost as long as the actual text. 2C-2, where cannabis use is prohibited, smoking and vaping of cannabis and any derivative thereof in any form or in municipally owned or leased property is prohibited. 2C-3, the effectuation would be that any person who violates the provisions of this ordinance shall be subject to a fine of $250. So the important part here is smoking and vaping of cannabis and any derivative thereof in any form on or in municipally owned or leased property. Those are the two important parts. Smoking and vaping of cannabis and its derivatives and on municipally owned or leased property. So there have been a number of questions that have come up. I had my question that you guys saw in public comment. I try to keep things when I go to public comment nice and short and sweet. To be fair to the ordinance, one of the things the first things you're going to see is that it's incredibly short and it's really easily understood. It's written in common parlance. It's also, as you guys will find out from other towns, it's also significantly more lax than the towns around us. For example, in the case of this ordinance, no, the ordinance does not apply to roads, according to Attorney Randy DeBella.
Randy, there was also some questions concerning municipal property. So as mentioned before, what about a town road? What about the fact, are you on a cul-de-sac?
A town road or a cul-de-sac will be considered a property of way. In other words, either by easement or by dedication or taking. That's a transient area. That doesn't apply.
Thank you, Randy.
Ask a question, get an answer. So we can compare this ordinance to the ordinances that have been enacted in other towns, as Mayor Bass did in his analysis and his research going into this proposal.
Quickly, some of the research that I did was, how are other towns handling this? So let's check the tape. Let's check the city of Torrington. Any product containing made or derivative of tobacco or nicotine, marijuana, hemp, or any of their derivatives that are intended for human consumption, whether smoked, heated, chewed, dissolved, inhaled, snorted, sniffed, or ingested by any other means, including but not limited to cigarettes, cigars, little cigars, chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco, snuff, and edibles, is not allowed. That's the city of Torrington. Let's look at Bethel.
Significantly more stringent.
No smoking or alcohol of use of drugs on any town fields or parks. Smoke-free zone. Let's look at Newtown. Drugs, tobacco products, or glass containers are strictly prohibited inside all parks at all times. Violators may be prosecuted.
And it goes on from there. So all of the other towns, it seems, that are proposing this type of legislation are proposing legislation that is significantly more restrictive than what's being proposed here. It also only applies to town properties and only applies to smoking and vaping. And we'll come back to the public versus private sector here. But notice how Torrington's regulations explicitly restricted consumption via things like gummies and edibles and lollipops. And from what I understand, there's now chewing gum that you can get that has THC baked into it. So no, this is something that's only going to be applying, and there's a reason this is the case. It's only going to be applying to the smoking and vaping of cannabis.
It was mentioned here at public meeting where there's some sort of non-clarity about this. Let me reread it so those watching now and in the minutes and you as town council can get this. This would be 2C2, where cannabis use is prohibited. Smoking and vaping of cannabis and any derivative thereof in any form on or in a municipality owned or leased property is prohibited. Seems pretty cut and dry to me. Our town attorney is here. So Randy, this is intended for only smoking and vaping of cannabis.
That's how I was instructed to draft it, and that's how I drafted it.
Thank you.
So 3 times, folks. It only applies to smoking and vaping. If you have edibles, if you have a lollipop, if you have chewing gum, if you have tablets, if you have some other means of consuming the THC other than to smoke or to vape it, perfectly legal on and in town properties as far as I can tell. So this is not a ban on the use of cannabis. It's a ban on the smoking and vaping of it. So the question then, now that we've gone over the what, and we've beaten the what to absolute death, why was this policy put into place? Let's understand the background behind it. Let's understand the structure and its intent. What was the thinking behind this? And we get an answer as to why you would specify cannabis rather than just expanding the smoking ordinances from Pete at that meeting as well.
Now, we could have done something similar. I asked Randy. We could have just changed our policy to include cannabis in our smoking regulations. No, I wanted us to be way more transparent than that. I want the public to know that smoking cannabis on town property, if this goes through, is illegal. And there's a proper mechanism put in place, which happens to be town council and this ordinance.
So in this case, he's recommended this ordinance. Well, the town council has requested that the town attorneys draft an ordinance that would prohibit the smoking and vaping of cannabis on town properties, primarily. And instead of just expanding the existing definitions, he wants to be explicit about it. He wants to make it so that there's absolute certainty and clarity on what it is they're prohibiting, where, how, and basically why. And of course, there is the secondary characteristic as to why you wouldn't just allow it in general of secondhand smoke. And we're going to get into that in just a minute here, but the idea is that when you're chewing a gummy, when you're sucking a lollipop, when you're chewing chewing gum, there's no way that you can be interfering with my consent in doing that because it doesn't affect me in any way, right? Like if you're breathing smoke into my face, regardless of what smoke that is, it could just be campfire smoke for all that matters. The fact that it is being blown into my face means that there is an element of consent that's removed. So returning the element of consent would be to preclude that from happening, at least in a legal manner. Now, again, there's a difference between private and public sector. And the reason there's a difference between the private and public sector, of course, is that in the public sector, everyone has right to that property. In the private sector, I can, if you come into my property as an adult and I can exclude kids, it's private property. I can tell people, listen, you're not allowed to come in if you're under 18. Deal with it. You're not allowed to come into my bar unless you're under 21 or unless you're over 21 or over. Deal with it, right? You can exclude whoever you want. And in doing so, you can basically have well-documented. It can be well documented that you guys are a place where there's going to be clouds of smoke. S.J. Barrington's in the 90s, right? It's a place there, going into that bar, number one, you're not going to be allowed. Well, you're not supposed to be allowed in if you're under 21. And on top of that, it's going to be a place that's just going to have a cloud of smoke over it, right? In that case, we can know that there's consent because we have an informed public on the fact that that's the matter. anyone can go in and instantly recognize that that's the case. And on top of that, we don't have any kids involved, which means that kids can't consent. Children can't consent. Now, where exactly that age of consent should be in Connecticut, it's 16. When it comes to consent, when it comes to things like the purchase of tobacco products, I think they just upped it to 21. It was 18 for a long time. When it comes to alcohol, it's 21. So again, even the state of Connecticut can't pick where the age of consent ought to be. But the point is that below a certain age, children cannot offer consent, which is why when you have something like a town property, you have to allow anyone to be on that property. All you can control really is time and manner, right? You can't tell somebody who's under 18 they can't go to town council. They can't go to a town council meeting. You can't do that. And because of that, then what you have is a problem with secondhand smoke. It's the same argument for regulation when it comes to pollution. If you're going to pollute the river and that river is necessarily upstream of my property, you've now affected my property directly. You've involved me into this transaction, which was supposed to have mutual consent without my consent. If you're in a situation where it's a pond and every single property in that pond understands that all of their septic tanks are just going, all of their septic is going straight into the pond, you have implied consent, because there's no way it's going to affect anything other than the properties that are doing the thing in the first place. So when it comes to town properties, the best argument you have in favor of this very narrow band of restriction is the fact that there is secondhand smoke to consider. And now there is a liability question to be had, but it's within the framework of the secondhand smoke. As in, it's a colossal stretch, and any court that gets presented with this case should never even hear it and should dismiss it offhand. But there is something of a liability. I caught cancer, and the reason I caught cancer is because you allowed smoking to happen on your property, and I was constantly exposed to the secondhand smoke. It's a stretch. It's a colossal stretch, but technically there is something of a liability there, and that's not really what Pete, I think, was getting at, though I imagine that's probably what the attorneys were getting at when he presents the liability argument. And watch where this goes, because this is actually a weak argument.
So some of the things we did talk about the last town council meeting, first and foremost, is the secondhand smoke and the fact that public places are supposed to be for everyone, non-exclusive of anybody, right? It's all supposed to be equal. Now, with that in mind too, as Randy will tell you, we have a very litigious society nowadays.
You could stop there.
They will sue for anything. So as I was telling Randy, you could be smoking a joint, right, down by the river, and you could be walking on the sidewalk, right, that's down there, the river thing, and fall because you're pretty high, right? Because who knows, maybe you got a real good, got a real potent patch there, right? So, and you fall. You're going to sue the town. Let's say you get in the car, right, Randy? And now you're driving, and you crash, and you hit someone. And they're going to say, where did you smoke that's marijuana cigarette or that joint? Where did you smoke? Oh, it's over there in the town. Oh, really? There could be some litigation that could come before it. So we kind of have to hedge our bets, so to speak. Hence why, besides the second-hand smoke, that we could get sued for that now, too. We have to really minimize our risk, and that's pretty much one of the main drivers and reasons why we're looking at town properties not allowing that for the town property. Now, as far as your own home and everything else, I know there was a couple conjectures. You know, that's your own home. You know what I mean?
So then why limit it to just smoking and vaping? So he presents the argument that I just made, which, again, it's a reach. It's a little bit of a reach in terms of the liability in that case. It's a little bit of a reach. You could just make the consent argument, which is a great argument on principle. Remember that. We're going to come back to that. The strongest arguments are the ones on principle, but they're also not the most persuasive. So we wind up going to this other argument that lends itself to, why would you just limit smoking and vaping then? Why wouldn't you then use this argument to say, all right, well, this is the argument we're going to use to get rid of gummies and edibles and tablets. right? Because if the idea is you're trying to restrict people from being high, from getting high on town properties, then you wouldn't just limit this to smoking and vaping, and you wouldn't harp on the fact that all you're doing is limiting smoking and vaping. Right? Like, and just to be clear, too, at the end, he does specify that this is town properties, has nothing to do with the private sector. And again, the calculus would be different if what we're talking about is the private sector. In fact, I'm the crazy libertarian in the room that believes that if a place like O'Connor's wants to allow smoking of cigarettes inside O'Connor's, if S.J. Barrington's wants to go back to where it was in the 90s, where it allowed smoking inside the bar, they should be allowed to do that. You should 100% be allowed to do that. And the thing is that, like, for those of us who don't smoke cigarettes, when there's cigarette smoking inside a venue, you know it right away, instantly. You walk through the door, and you cannot make the argument that you didn't know it was taking place if you're a non-smoker and you're over 21 and you're going into O'Connor's, right? Sorry to dunk on O'Connor's if that's the case, but we all know the crowd. We've all seen the people that stand outside O'Connor's. It's one of these few establishments where almost everyone who goes in there is a smoker of some kind. They should be allowed to smoke inside. They shouldn't have to stand outside in the cold and smoke their cigarettes. Again, that's O'Connor's decision to make, but that's how far I'm willing to go with that. But the real issue here is we know the real why as to what's taking place here. And the real liability is the dubious, and I explained it, it's a reach. It's the dubious cancer from secondhand smoke argument where, on public property, the town is liable, and on private property, they're not. So there is a case for this on public property through the extremely narrow scope that this ordinance is being presented. If there was a restrictive ordinance on the smoking of marijuana that I would be in favor of, it would be this one. It's tailored to a very narrow scope, and because of that, I'm torn. In the case of the public versus the private sector, if this was a restriction on the private sector, there'd be an automatic no. This would be an automatic no, and that's in large part because you should be devolving that decision to the business owner. And devolution is going to come up later in the show. This shouldn't be imposed upon the town of New Milford from the state, and the town of New Milford shouldn't be imposing that upon the private sector. However, when it comes to an imposition upon itself, especially in the town where we saw the poll, though the framing of the poll was wildly incorrect, the results of the poll did show that the town was fairly noticeably, at least those who responded to the poll on Facebook, were in favor of a restriction of a prohibition of in that case, the use and consumption of marijuana on all town properties. And, there's no context there to explain that, the roads don't count, right? So if you're a passenger in a car, you can smoke all the weed you want. And if you and your neighbor want to pull up chairs and go out to the end of the cul-de-sac at night and just watch the stars, you're allowed to do that, even though you're on what's technically a property of the town, and it's a property of way, as Attorney DeBella explained it. So maybe what I would say is, then let's amend this maybe to specify certain exempted properties. Is something like Clatter Valley a place that you'd be willing to provide an exemption? Is something like Sega Meadows, where there's no permanent standing structure, so it's not possible to have it be smoked indoors, where you do technically occasionally allow some camping, so it's not the open flame by itself that you're concerned with. And where, let's be honest, like it's a bunch of wooded trails with a wide open field. Let's be honest, like the whole secondhand smoke thing in a place like that is a reach. I'm not saying there's no argument. I'm saying it's a reach. So maybe what you would do is, instead of having it be something like, maybe you don't want to have the weed smoking on the green. Maybe everyone agrees that, having bong circles on the green is probably not the image that we want for the green. Although we have no problem with it at other places. Maybe you don't want it at Addis Park because there's no way to distinguish between operating the boat when high and not, right? Maybe there are some places, I would say the property to go to would be Lindeming. Would you be okay with people smoking weed at Lindeming? Right? Because there are parts of Lindeming where you're kind of off to the side. You're not really near anybody. But a huge amount of Lindeming's usage is right on the beach where you're surrounded by people, and a ton of them are young kids. So, again, maybe the solution here is we explicitly specify the properties that we want to exempt. And the one that I want to throw out to you guys, let me know in the comment section, what do you think? Would you guys be okay with smoking, not consumption, smoking marijuana at Lindeming? And when I say at Lindeming, there's no way to parcel that off. So it's got to be anywhere at Lindeming. I'm not trying to give you guys a gotcha. Let me know in the comments. What do you guys think? Now, again, I've given you the principled, nuanced take. There are others out there that are opposed to this, that are opposed to the proposed ordinance, which would prohibit the smoking, because they're red team bad. Pete Bass, red team. Therefore, ordinance bad. Right? We're not going to give them the time of day. I'm not going to give them names. We all know who they are. I'm not going to read their quotes. No, I'm not giving them the time of the day. The point is, you don't, and even for those of us who are now, for the first time ever, in agreement with those people, don't just look at the conclusions. What matters is the way that they get to the conclusions. Look at the arguments, which, again, I've alluded to this. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that after we get through the next ordinance, which it's actually going to expand on this concept, which is the hot work ordinance. So I should probably put together a video, because it's clear to me that many of the people in the room don't understand what hot work is. And in this case, we have an imposition explicitly on only the private sector. Well, on the private sector. It's going to involve the town buildings as well. But the idea is that what's being proposed is an ordinance that would require certain building sites and certain construction sites and renovation sites and demolition sites to apply for a permit through the fire marshal's, through the office of the fire marshal, for hot work if they're intending to conduct hot work there. Hot work is anything that involves the use of heat. For example, welding uses an arc. The electrical arc heats up the air, and thus heats up the metal. The metals melt into each other. Pardon me. If you're sweating a pipe, if you're talking about soldering, you have a flame. The flame heats up the metal melts and forms a bond between the two copper pipes, right? If we're talking about what's another hot work? If we're talking about using a torch to liquefy an adhesive product for roofing materials, that's what we're talking about here. That's what hot work is. And I'm going to probably have to put together a video and just go to the shop with my cameras and say, all right, this is what this tool is. This is what it does. This is how it works. This is what hot work means. Because I think this is a case where, too, we've actually gone on principle and also in practice too far in this matter. So we're going to get in. I want to get my thoughts on the matter in just a bit. But the first thing I want to do is say that I don't yet have a link to the text itself. The copy of the ordinance that I had, proposed ordinance, was something I had to go to the town clerk and request, and I only got one and had to hand it over to somebody. I let somebody else have it at the end of the town council meeting, and I forgot to get down to the town clerk's office. So tomorrow, hopefully I'll be able to get that. The link to the ordinance for the cannabis proposal is in the video's description for the cannabis public hearing. And yes, I did separate those two hearings out so you guys can have better access to that and you guys can more easily access that information. We're going to get into that. So we're going to, when I get that link built, when I get that document brought onto the internet, because it's not on the internet right now, you have to request a physical copy from the town clerk's office. I'll get that link out to everybody. In the meantime, the closest we can do, because it's kind of long, I didn't have time to transcribe this. And quite frankly, I'm not going to bother to transcribe this. Here's Pete Bass reading the ordinance for everybody.
And to read the hot work permit ordinance, section 5B-24, hot work permit required and permit fee. Any non-residential building work activity, including new construction, renovations, demolition, addition, roofing, plumbing, steel fabrication and the like involving hot work as set forth in the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, Standard 51B, NFPA 1, Chapter 41, as is amended, shall require a permit issued by the New Milford Fire Marshal pursuant to an application on the form furnished by the fire marshal and the following fire marshal inspection before commencing work. The fee for a hot work permit shall be $50. Section 5B-24A, hot work defined. Hot work is any activity or process that involves open flames or that generates sparks or heat and includes but not limited to welding and allied processes, heat treating, grinding, thawing pipes, powder-driven fasteners, hot riveting, torch-applied roofing, pipe sweating, and any similar applications producing or using sparks, flame, or heat. 5B-24B, inspections, work standards, and fire watch. Permittees must schedule an inspection of the subject premises before beginning hot work and must employ a fire watch. All hot work and fire watch activities must be conducted in compliance with and conformity to NFPA 51B and NFPA 1, Chapter 41, standard as amended and adopted by the state of Connecticut. 5B-24C, hours of hot work, duration of permit. Hot work activity may only be conducted between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., Monday through Friday, excluding holidays. Hot work permits are valid from the date of issuance through 6 p.m. Friday of the same week of issuance. Hot work outside the above defined parameters must not be undertaken without express prior approval of the fire marshal. 5B-24D, enforcement, appeal. Any persons or firm that violates the provisions of this ordinance shall be issued a notice of violation and assessed a civil penalty of $200 per day for each day the violation continues. A violation may be appealed pursuant to the provisions of Connecticut General Statutes 7-152C.
So remember those definitions, because we're going to come back to that. I know it was a lot to digest, but the part that everybody needed to focus on was the definitions there, and especially because of at the end where it says that use or produce sparks, flame, or heat. Use or produce sparks, flames, or heat. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that. I got some video for you on that matter, so you won't have to have it completely memorized, but let's put a pin in that thought before we move on. But most importantly, again, as we focus on the what right now, where does it apply? It applies on non-residential properties. So this is only commercial. This is not residential properties. This is Fire Marshal Reynolds, I think, from Mayor Bass.
And Kevin, there's been some conjecture like, I'm at my house and, I'm doing a little work in my own house. Does this apply to residential?
Absolutely not.
Only for commercial, correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin.
So then to further specify what this applies to, Councilman Cosgrove, points out that this applies to from that definitions, construction, etc., renovation, demolition, etc., not regular and ongoing work at, say, like an auto body where they do all this welding on a regular basis in that one location. This is clip 9.
And I think you clarified this in the original council meeting, but just for the purposes of the public tonight, this only applies to construction, renovation, repair projects in commercial buildings. It does not apply to businesses in town that use welding routinely, like body shops and that sort of thing.
No, because they have safeguards in place already in the daily aspects of their business.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
So we've gone over the what. Now it's time to go over the why. And quite frankly, we've beaten this topic to absolute death on this show over the course of this year. We all know why. And the answer is, sadly, reactionary politics. And reactionary politics to the New Milford High School roof fire. And as I explained in a previous episode of the show, reactionary politics is the worst politics. And this is why you end up producing policy like what we're seeing here. Again, the cannabis ordinance, there's a pathway to me being okay with it. I don't know if there is with this one here, but Mayor Bass and Fire Marshal Reynolds make this undeniably clear that this was the origin and impetus for this ordinance.
I'd like to ask our fire marshal, Kevin Reynolds, to come up and explain to the public and to the council the reasons stated that he believes, and I believe, that we need a hot work ordinance. And Kevin, before we start, I know there was some conjecture about, does the town really need this? Kevin, are you aware that Litchfield School had a fire?
Yes.
And do you know anything about that fire in Litchfield?
All I know is it was on the roof, and from what I heard, I did not talk to any official up there, that it was caused by a torching process.
So we had another school roof that caught on fire due to hot work. That's kind of right up the road from our town.
Right.
And Kevin, as our fire marshal, do you believe this is something that we need to do?
I believe, yes, it is something we should definitely do to protect the assets of the town and the businesses in this town.
Plain reactionary governance, which is why there's also essentially no existing law to compare this to, unlike there was with the proposed cannabis ordinance. Brandon DeBella explains the legal origins.
The reason, first of all, I drafted that statute. Essentially, I didn't lift it. I drafted it because the ones that I looked at were, in my opinion, my experience, inadequate. The reason I did commercial is to avoid the plumber sweating a pipe on a water heater. That's why it was done. And I didn't find any other ordinances that had been drafted related to residential property. The fire marshal instructed me to make sure that I limited this to commercial property, and that's what I did. It was drafted again, essentially from scratch. So the reality is that the blending of OSHA regulations and the blending of NFPA regulations is something that had to be done in order to craft this ordinance, and that's where it came from.
So let's talk about the reality, which is that with this ordinance, this isn't going to prevent anything. This isn't going to prevent anything, especially when the contractor is doing hot work when they've been explicitly told not to, or they just plain and simple violate the rules regarding fire watch. I mean, all this does at best, this is a CYA. At best, this is covering your behind, but you're not really covering your behinds after the fact when it's not town property. Again, we talked about this with the cannabis ordinance. There is a liability that the town has to its properties. A town does not have liability to not its properties. The calculus here would be completely different if it was limited to town properties, but it's not. And, one of the things that's going to happen as a result of this, you're not going to really see it all that much. And, Hillary Ram does bring up the diminishing of developers. And unfortunately, she doesn't do a good job of presenting the case. The reason that this is going to have a deleterious effect on development and developers in general isn't the $50 fee that's associated with it. But, and it's not because, as it's going to get gaslit from the proverbial other side, it's not because they don't want to be safe, right? The reason that this is going to be a hindrance to developers and why this will wind up having a deleterious effect on development is because they have to file a permit. It doesn't mean they wouldn't do the things that the permit demands otherwise, right? And it doesn't mean they wouldn't otherwise adhere to the terms of the permit. But there is a good question to be asked here. Why are we only hearing about this at public schools? Could it have more to do with vetting the contractor? Whether the contractor will actually do the thing? Could it be that the public sector has no obligation to respond to market influences? And that this is one of the primary flaws of public schooling to begin with? The reason housing is so expensive is because of the shortages in economics that permitting processes result in. In this case, it's almost certainly not going to be people just not coming to New Milford because they have to file this permit. It's going to be that people aren't coming to New Milford because there's no way to make money there because of scheduling. So what this is going to do is instead of, let's say it takes you 9 months to build a house, right? Let's say it takes 9 months. I have no idea how long it actually takes today. It could be as little as 3 months. Let's say it takes 3 months to build a house, right? If this causes a crimp in the schedule and causes that housing to go out 2 weeks, well, imagine if you could build 3 houses in a year, because let's say you can't really do any meaningful building for let's say December, January, and February, right? No meaningful buildings taking place. If you extend that out 2 weeks, then with each one of those building projects, over time, what that's going to do is it's going to backlog all that development. So instead of, let's say over the course of 3 years, you get, say, 200 houses, and I'm just going with houses because it's an easy thing to conceptualize. Well, it's not houses actually. Let's say it applies only to commercial. Let's say instead of getting these office buildings, so let's say you need like my office here. It's not that big an office, but it serves my needs exactly. It does exactly what I need it to do. It's a really small office with no windows, but I don't want no windows because of the audio properties, right? Because of the acoustic properties of glass are not conducive to have for what I do, right? If those building projects get pushed down and pushed down and pushed down, what that means is the checks that they're collecting over time take more time to aggregate. And as a result, instead of having 200 commercial office spaces over the course of 3 years, you wind up with, say, 180. So not only do we have less of the thing, where we have a shortage relative to demand of the thing, and thus the price goes up because of the shortage in demand. Not only do we have that, you have a situation where the developers are going to have to front all of this money, and it's going to take them longer to get it back, which means that there's going to be certain investments that aren't going to be worth investing in over the course of time. And that over the course of time, you'll see less development. And because there is less development and less money to be had in the region broadly, you're going to see developers generally turn away from New Milford because of the restrictive permitting and zoning processes that exist in that town in the first place. This is why places like Middle Tennessee are exploding in growth. This is why the I-4 corridor in northern Florida is experiencing explosive growth. This is why a huge part of why people are running out of the state of Connecticut. And that's because of when you enact these policies, just snowball endless numbers of these types of policies that have this restrictive effect on private development, the cost of doing everything just explodes. And again, this is just going to wind up being baked into the developer schedules. And in the end, the people that are going to pay for it are you and me. In the end, this is an expense that's just going to this is an expense that is extrapolated from opportunity cost that's just going to get passed down to you and I, the consumers. This is what these things tend to do. And, I'm not one to complain without a solution. So I offered a solution in the event that people don't want this to not pass. Some of you may have seen it here. Where do I have that? Do I have that? I don't believe I do have that. So some of you may have seen. Let me bring up my notes again. Some of you may have seen my commentary on that at the town council meeting, because I didn't offer my commentary until after the public hearing was over and at the town council meeting. But here's the commentary that kind of sums up my solution. Mike Sennello, 111 Willow Springs. So I should have actually spoken during the hot work permit public hearing. In 5B24A, hot work defined. The final line out of context says any similar applications producing or using sparks, flame, or heat. So it lists a number of the processes there. Welding and allied processes. These use heat. That's what the arc does, is it creates heat and melts metal. Heat treating, grinding, thawing pipes, powder-driven fasteners, these are your ram sets. Hot riveting, which I don't imagine we're ever going to get here in New Milford. Torch-applied roofing, which is open flame. Pipe sweating, which is open flame. Any other similar application producing or using sparks. So the recommendation I would make would be to strike the words producing or from that final line, because if that's going to be the case, then the reason that any form of cutting metal, which is not strictly mechanical, is going to produce sparks. They may be for so short a burst that you'll never see them, and they may not be hot enough to actually set anything in building materials on fire, which is what the purpose of the permit is for. So, for example, we just had the gutters done here on this building. Those gutters have downspouts. I can assure you they were cut on site. I can assure you that because of the age of the building, they were cut on site. This is done with an angle grinder like this, that fast. So for something like that seems kind of overkill, especially if you're working on a sidewalk over concrete. To have to pay a guy, that means every roofer who's going to get a commercial job is going to have somebody there every roofer who gets a commercial job who's doing these gutters and downspouts, they're going to have to apply for this permit. They're going to have to wait to finish these gutter processes to get the approval of this permit. So the way you fix that is to just simply say using sparks, flame, or heat. So in the case of a powder-driven fastener, you're using the rapid expansion of gas created by that 22 shell. It's not a full 22 shell, but you're using the powder that's being ignited by the primer. Rapid expansion of gas. That heat is what projects the nail, usually into concrete, well, through wood and into concrete. So I would say that to alleviate a number of Ms. Ram's concerns, all you'd have to do is strike 2 words from this thing, and that would significantly tone down the language of the permits so that we're not having something, again, like downspouts being cut by angle grinders. Yes, they're aluminum in almost every single case. In the case of cutting aluminum, you're probably not going to see the sparks because, again, they burn so quickly and they burn so, the temperature is so low compared to cutting steel, for example, that you're probably not even going to see it. It's going to be an instantaneous flash. So that's my recommendation for the hot work permit. Just striking those 2 words from 5B24A. So I did upload this onto my YouTube channel. You guys can see that right there where it says simply strike these 2 words. So if you guys ever want to go revisit that, you can. Making sure that I have my audio turned down for all of that. Yeah. So the point that I'm bringing up here is that is that by changing those 2 words, just those 2 words, by removing just those 2 words, and I'm actually going to double down on this because Cosgrove and I had a conversation about that. By removing just those 2 words, it becomes significantly less restrictive, right? If you're talking about a part of the construction process that produces heat, belt sanders produce heat. You could just be sanding down a little bit of excess spackle. That's going to produce heat. You could be if you've got metal studs like I do here in my office, and you're trying to hang things from metal studs. Let's say you're doing the right thing, which these guys didn't do, and putting a backer board onto those metal studs behind the sheetrock. Then you're going to have to drill into those metal studs. Drilling into the metal studs is going to produce heat. That's completely ridiculous to have to apply for a hot work permit for something like that. So the example that Chris and I brought up was what happens if you're angle grinding, if you're grinding down, say, a weldment on a steel structure. Well, first things first, if you're going to be doing that with a weldment, then you're going to have to apply for the hot work permit anyways, because what we're talking about is using the heat in the first place. I don't think you should have to apply for a hot work permit unless unless what it is, unless the thing you're doing is by its very nature using that heat. The point of the thing is the heat, right? It's not a secondary feature that happens by pure happenstance to be a product of the thing. Again, this could, if you wanted to, we talked about drills, we talked about belt sanders. If you wanted to be a thermodynamics dick about it, then part of what allows the drill to turn at all is an electric motor that uses the arcing process to spin that motor. And technically there's a microscopic arc inside all electric motors, which means literally every battery-powered power tool on Earth is going to wind up requiring a hot work permit if you're going to be a thermodynamics dick about it. And again, I get Kevin Reynolds is probably not going to be a thermodynamics dick about it, but Kevin Reynolds is who is there now. And you don't do this for who is there now. You do these things on principle, right? So it doesn't matter that Kevin Reynolds is not a dick. In 50 years' time, you could get somebody who's a dick and has a neighbor that built a fence that's too tall and the 2 neighbors don't get along and that fire marshal doesn't like it. No, you're going to get the fire marshal's going to come in and whack this guy with fines and halt the entire process because there's a guy using a drill. And it has an electric motor. And if you want to be a thermodynamics dick about it, that winds up producing spark. Just about everything you do that involves friction. In fact, literally everything you do that involves friction that doesn't have an outside cooling process is going to wind up producing heat. Having hand warmers in your boots is going to wind up producing heat, right? So I talked about how you build these things on principle, and on that matter, as to my thoughts on the matter, You oppose these things on principle, or at least you do things like I suggested and amend them on principle, on principle, and to not drive away business. And in doing so, you restore consent of the governed. You restore mutual consent in all transactions. And that's kind of exactly why the conversation about the zoning opt-out went the way it did. And we've gone over this whole thing before, so we're not going to go into great detail. But also on Monday night, the zoning so there's some regulation coming in from Hartford that is going to impose upon our zoning certain mandated ordinance changes to our code of zoning ordinances. And those changes, although I'm mostly in favor of the content of those proposals, of that legislation, although I'm in favor of the changes that they would make, those changes should obviously be happening here. And it's so obvious that a Democrat supermajority or near supermajority in both houses had to build in this opt-out. So if by 2/3 majority, the zoning board in your town opts out of these provisions, and then the town council by 2/3 majority opts out of these ordinance changes that Hartford is imposing on us, then you no longer have those ordinance changes imposed upon you. And again, we've talked about this before. I'm not going to go over this in too great a detail. We talked about this on the March 6, 2022 episode of the Mike Sennello Show. Let me pull up my notes here. We also talked about this. I also did provide commentary at the February 14th, 2022 town council meeting. And I freeze framed, of course, on when my eyes were closed, and man, does that look great on me. And I provided some commentary on February 14th. So for those of you that have seen that have been following along, yes, we've already talked about that. So we're not going to go over the exact content of the provisions themselves. And there's a reason that's the case. Because the content, if you're acting on principle of the actual piece of legislation that you're opting out of it as it imposes upon the local zoning ordinances, shouldn't matter. Now, I've talked on the show about arguing on principle. Now, and I've also talked about this previously too, but we're going to go over it briefly again. I've proposed that there are 3 tiers of argumentation. There's arguing on principle, there's arguing on practice, and there's arguing on medicine. And there's arguing on optics. The strongest form of argumentation is the arguments on principle. The weakest is the arguments on optics. In between that is the arguments on practice. And the reason, very straightforwardly, is that if you present an argument that's properly on principle, that in order to negate that, you have to introduce a new principle. You can't actually negate an argument on principle. You'd have to present a new argument that would contradict that previous argument. So it wouldn't actually be working even within the framework of that argument. That's how strong arguments on principle are. That you have to present an entirely new argument. Arguments on practice are arguments where you can work within the framework of the argument, but in order to dismantle the conclusions to be drawn, all you have to do is modify the conditions of the argument, right? So in the case of arguing for something on practice, well, what happens if this condition isn't there? Well, then the argument falls apart. In the case of arguments on optics, you don't even have to consider the inputs here. You can just take the argument itself and say, I don't care. You can dismantle the argument with that argument, not with an argument with different conditions, not with a different argument, but with the argument itself unadulterated. And the example I've given, I should really put out a video on my series on philosophical concepts of Mike's 3 tiers of argumentation and Mike's rule. But the way that this works, the example I've used is stealing medicine. Let's say you've got some life-saving medicine that you need, right? Should you steal the medicine? One answer would be no, stealing is bad. No, stealing is bad, period. No matter what. Well, what if no? There is no what if. Stealing is bad, period. You don't steal the medicine. Well, what if, then he might die if he doesn't do all the other things he would need to do to obtain the medicine legally. And that's a tragedy, but you shouldn't steal medicine. Don't steal the medicine. Okay, now let's argue on, in order to negate that, you have to introduce an entirely new principle You have to look at this from an entirely new framework. So you can't even work within the same framework and negate that stealing is wrong. Maybe you could break down the concept of what constitutes stealing. And then again, you're dealing with a philosophical concept that goes beyond the argument itself. So if we're arguing in practice, you should steal the medicine because it's really expensive and you can't afford it unless you steal it. You can't afford it at the current price unless you steal it. Oh, well, I mean, the condition that you would change then is, well, it's not the only show in town. There's another pharmacy right across the street that sells it for half the price. Right? So in that case, if your argument is you should steal it because it's unaffordable, well, what happens when there's a pharmacy right across the street that's selling it for an affordable price? Well, then you shouldn't steal it because it is affordable. So all you have to do in that case is change the because it's unaffordable. All you have to do is change the conditions and the argument falls apart. How about argument on optics? You should steal it. You should steal the medicine because we don't want to look like a town that doesn't care for its elderly. Because won't somebody please think of the children? And the way you negate this argument is, no, I don't care. I don't care what the rest of the town thinks of us, right? You can work within that same argument and say, no, I don't care about the optics. Right? I could argue that you shouldn't steal the medicine because we should be a town of law and order. We don't want to look like we're some town that doesn't care about law and order and has this high level of crime rates that scare away the developers and scare away business owners. And I could say, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care about the optics. In fact, I just presented two arguments from the same side of the coin that are the optics argument. It's just the optics argument turned around. If you steal it, it's going to make us look bad. Oh, no, I disagree. I think if we steal it, it's going to make us look good. So in that case, in a case of an optics argument, it's so weak that I can use the argument itself against itself. Unfortunately, the strength of unfortunately, we have this is not how it plays out in the real world. This is not how the strength of an argument isn't saying which argument is the one that's going to convince the most people. And in fact, this is Mike's rule. I've talked about it before. The strength of an argument is inversely proportional to the effectiveness of the argument. In the case of the principled argument to steal the medicine versus the optics argument to steal the medicine, most people are going to be persuaded to either steal the medicine or not steal the medicine based on how it's going to make them look. On the optics argument, how does this look, right? The remainder are going to be convinced almost entirely on the arguments in practice. Well, that it's unaffordable, therefore he should steal it. Well, what happens when it becomes affordable? What happens when there's, yeah. So that's going to capture basically everyone else. The argument of stealing is wrong, you shouldn't steal it, is unfortunately not going to convince people. It's unfortunately not an effective argument, even though it's a stronger one. So Mike's rule, the strength of an argument is inversely proportional to the effectiveness of the argument, is something that we're going to see in just a moment in real time, and it's not a good thing. I wish Mike's rule was wrong, but it's not. And now, unlike all the other topics tonight, we started with my take, and now we're going to go into detail. Now we're going to explain the what. So first thing first, just so we're clear, before I get gaslit, we should be opting out of the zoning mandates being imposed upon New Milford by Hartford because zoning matters should be handled at the municipal level, and anything else is a dereliction of your duly elected duty. That's the only reason. That's the only conversation to be had. And like I said, we're not even going to read the legislation because the principle I just presented is true regardless of the content of the legislation. Unfortunately, though, this is largely wise. Excuse me. This is largely why zoning voted to opt out of the. Excuse me. Fortunately, this is largely why zoning voted to opt out 4-1, though it's not a winning argument. We've been here before. We did this before. Town council voted to opt out 5-3, which was not enough to meet the 2/3 majority requirement of the opt-out clause, which means this was actually imposed upon us at the time. So why are we revisiting this? The thing failed. And in fact, this is why I spoke at public comment. Let me pull up my public comment so you guys can see it. And, I would like it. Maybe there's a rationale. but we got to cover our behinds at the very least. Why is it that we're revisiting this? This is 13.
I would love to hear from the attorney the rationale for agenda item 9 being on here. I am totally in favor of opting out of the statutes, even though I like the statutes. They should be coming from the town of New Milford. We have a zoning ordinance process for a reason. That should be devolved to us. However, my desired outcome was decided upon and didn't happen. So this was an L for me, if you will. But we already decided upon this. And though the opt-out did not achieve, though there was a majority, the opt-out did not achieve the necessary, I believe it was 2/3 to opt out. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be on the agenda. I'm saying I'd like to know the reason. And the attorney is here to give us a good reason, especially if we're doing a CYA job, covering your behind in the event that, something gets brought up. Why was this decided upon twice? Why was this on the agenda twice? So that's all I would like for tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And we know exactly who it is that would bring that question up, and we know exactly who it is who would say, why was this brought up twice? And you should cover your behind. And when you ask a question, you should get an answer. And Monday night, I did.
To Attorney DeBello, I know by adding this back to the agenda, there has to be a kind of a new information. I know they continue to modify tons of different regulations in Hartford. So if you could opine as to what the new information that maybe the council hasn't heard or the public itself when it comes to this.
If the council hasn't heard it or hasn't assimilated it. The new information, I wasn't at that meeting, I wish I was. Because what it doesn't do, it doesn't tell you how this interacts with the rest of with the statute. And an example is mobile homes are now allowed as a matter of right on a single family property and as an accessory. We have lots that are down to 5,000 square feet in this town. That's something that needed to be understood. And I know you articulated it, but it didn't seem to be understood. So the reality is that, by the way, it's not a legal issue as to whether or not you consider this. It's a parliamentary issue under Robert's Rules of Order. The law does not preclude you from doing this.
Okay.
But again, it's up to your rules. So, but the reality is that if the commission, if the council feels that it did not have a sufficient world of information in order to make its determination, it can certainly consider it again. You're not stuck with bad legislation. I mean, Congress does it all the time.
And we've been here before. I'm going to share a link in the comments section now so you guys can see it. We have done all of this conversation before. This is for February 14th, 2022 Town Council meeting, where we went through all of this. And we were, at the time, stuck with bad legislation, and now we are not. As you can see, that's Bill Taylor presenting before the Town Council on February 14th, 2022. It's also where I made my commentary from before. What you guys should really do is check out Bill Taylor's brilliant full comments from that meeting. They're over 20 minutes long. I have them separated out into another video. Let me know in the comments. Should I be uploading it? Is this something you guys would be interested in? Because it's a brilliant dismantling and takedown of not only all of the false information and misinformation that was being spread at the time about the thing, but he also goes into brilliant detail and articulates the argument in a way that even I can't, surrounding not only why it is that the legislation itself is dumb and bad, according to him, but also why, on principle, we should be opting out of this, and that's why there was a 4-1 majority at the zoning board to opt out of these Hartford-originated mandates. So let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in. Again, it's brilliant, but it's like 20 minutes long. And at that meeting, it was clear that 5 town council members understood the point that Bill was making, that I'm making here tonight. We needed 6 town councilmen to understand that point in order to actually succeed in opting out, because we needed a 2/3 majority. And on that note, very briefly, if you're not going to be attending these town council meetings, you shouldn't be on town council. Resign. And that applies to the Republicans when they're not there for important decisions like the one I'm talking about. And that applies to, and I'll say her name, Mary Jane Lundgren. I'm sorry, Mary Jane, but if you're going to miss 8.5 months of town council meetings in person, then you should be resigning. And you should be finding somebody who can fill your shoes. Find a Democrat who's going to stand in your stead. I don't even care at this point. And no, we should not be allowing, especially now, we should not be allowing the councilmen to not have their feet held to the fire by the presence of the people in the room. When somebody addresses the podium at town council for public comment, you shouldn't have the protection, the proverbial protection of this screen. The virtual participation of town councilmen should have been over months ago. P, if you wind up watching this, Katie, if you guys are watching this, for the love of God, change the rules. Change the town council procedural rules and get rid of that stupid rule. Don't allow for virtual participation, in person or bust. And if there's a health concern that means that you can't even be in attendance at these meetings for 8.5 months, find someone else. Find someone else. And again, I'm dunking on a Republican here who wasn't who wasn't able to attend that meeting, or who didn't attend that meeting. I don't care if you're not able or not. If you're not able, then you're not able. If you're not able to attend, you're not able to serve. So don't. But Nahum was there. Mike Nahum was there, and he summed up the whole thing 9 months ago in actually just under a minute.
I guess the question I have is why is the state given, they want to have more accessory apartments, why are they giving us the ability to opt out?
Because I think they realize that when you get to some of the other out of the urban areas, it doesn't always fit.
Yeah, and that's the point I'm trying to get.
It just does not fit.
The state cannot create a regulation that fits for New Milford and fits for Bridgeport. It's just too hard, and to not want this left at the local level doesn't make any sense to me. Why would we cede any power to the state, whether we agree with them 100% or not? The argument we should have been having was at your meetings, at your public hearings, if you felt that's when it should have been done. Now we're getting the recommendation at a supermajority from zoning to go against that recommendation without having been at all those meetings. To me, would not be fair. In general, I feel that if Hartford's going to give us the ability to leave things at a local level without the quote unfunded mandate, I think that's just the way to go.
Damn right. And that's all there should be to it. And the town attorneys apparently very much agreed.
So I have a question. Did you have somebody from the state come and speak with you?
No, we took it to our town attorney, Randy DeBella, and he
That
worked
was
with
it.
us to understand the legalities of this. He worked with the other state land use and town attorneys, and they came back with a unanimous recommendation, to my knowledge. Attorney Tower could correct me if I'm wrong. Opt out was the advice we got, not only from our town attorney, but from multiple town attorneys.
So part of this conversation has to center around the point Mike was making at the beginning of his of what he was saying before. Why is there an opt-out in the legislation in the first place? These sort of things are super, super rare when it comes to legislation. Super rare. Why would you build a legislation and then also build a way to not have to adhere to the legislation? It should be fairly self-evident based on the fact that it's an opt-out that you're building into a piece of legislation. But these opt-out clauses are usually a red flag for terrible legislation. According to Councilman Cosgrove and me, since I also watched the process, the legislation was so unpalatable that the opt-out was the only way it would pass in the House and Senate in Hartford, with Democrat near supermajorities in both the House and Senate. So here's Chris Cosgrove with the real reason that the opt-out clause was there in the first place.
Mike, if I could add one thing to that, I followed this legislation as it was going through in Hartford pretty closely. And the opt-out came later in the process, I think because it was so unpopular outside of the larger urban areas. They couldn't have passed this legislation.
And we voted on it back then. We voted on it 9 months ago on February 14th. Here's what there were two provisions to opt out of. Here's what the first opt-out vote looked like. And pay attention to who's voting which way.
Motion to approve opting out of item 3D, provisions of PA 21-29, section 6A to D regarding allowances for accessory apartments, dwelling units, ADUs.
Second.
And there's a second by Councilman Cosgrove.
Okay.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
They're on lag.
So you saw who voted against. let's look at there was a second vote for opting out on the second half of this.
Okay, now we'll move to item 3E. Item 3E, I move that we opt out of the provisions of Connecticut General Statute, Section 8-2D, 9, as amended by PA 21-29, Section 4, regarding limitations on parking spaces for dwelling units.
Second.
Who did
Who
the
was
second?
that?
Was that you, Chris?
Castro.
Yep. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed?
They liked the legislation, therefore passed the legislation. This is an argument on practice. This is not an argument on principle, which means all you would have to do is present them with legislation they don't like, and they would opt out of it. They like the legislation, therefore they're not opting out of it. This time, things were a little bit different because it was a unanimous vote with the same 3 Democrats now switching their votes to be part of the unanimous consent to opt out of both provisions. And as Hillary Ram goes, so do the Democrats, at least those 3 in the room. That's why, Hillary, if you're watching, this is why we're going to be focusing on you tonight, because as you go, so do the other Dames, if you will. And never once did the 3 of them bring up the principle of devolution. Now, it's true that the word devolution didn't come up at all in the meeting. It did come up from the Republican side in the February 14th meeting, but the concept was absolutely brought up. And they were, again, the Dames, if you will, repeatedly defended the actual content of the legislation. Again, I agree, too, with the content of the legislation, but it's not relevant, which is why we're not even bringing it up this time around. We already did, but it's not relevant to the point that's being made. On principle, you should be opting out, period, regardless of the content. Now, with that in mind, this is how the vote went this time.
We have a motion and we have a second.
Second.
Okay.
Now we have 3 seconds.
Okay, now 3 seconds. Okay. All those in favor?
In
This
favor of
is- this-
opting out.
Opting out.
Opting
In
out.
favor, the motion is to opt out.
That's
Make that
9,
clear.
9A, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Sal? Yes, 9A.
See,
We
here,
have
see
to
the
do,
nod
then we have
going
to do
on?
9B.
See Hillary?
All those in favor, raise your hands. Doug?
You can hear her say on the condition.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Next is 9B. Katie?
Yes, so I'd like to move to approve that the town opt out of the provisions of Public Act 21-29, Section 4D 9, prohibiting the zoning regulations from requiring multiple dedicated parking spaces for dwelling units.
Second?
And we have a second. Any discussion? Seeing there is none, all those in favor by a hand vote, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And we have on the phone Councilman Skelly. Councilman Skelly.
Aye.
Carries unanimously. Thank you, everyone.
So, Hillary, what changed? Now, we saw at the beginning, I was trying to point this out, I don't know if you guys could catch it, Alexander Thomas nodding across nodding across the tables at Hillary, and we saw Hillary then, nodding back and whispering into Mary Jane Lindgren's ears, and you could hear the words on the condition, right, being exchanged between the two of them. So, Republicans in the room didn't change. If anything, they got more firm on Nahom's previous argument and more articulate in the matter. In fact, here's Chris Cosgrove with my nominee for town council speech of the year. This is clip 21. Go, Chris.
My one point is, this seems to be a solution in search of a problem. I don't see we have a problem.
That's a good point.
And in terms of, what's local control, I view local control is that we have some sort of standards in place that don't allow one person to infringe on neighbors' safety or their property value. And we put that control in the hands of our zoning commission and our zoning officer, who are answerable to the voters of this town. So to me, it's crazy to cede our rights, the rights of our public, to a few people in Hartford who think that they can write a law that can be equally applied over 169 towns. So that to me is just nuts. And if anybody, and once you opt in on that, then if our needs change, you can't change that. Look, what did we have? Did we have an issue with getting the state to change the timing of our lights on Bridge Street? Imagine if we need them to change zoning regulations. It'll never happen. Never. So we should never give up our rights to Hartford. And I will vote to opt out.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Like fist pumpingly awesome. So, guys, let me know in the comments what you think of Chris Cosgrove's statements there. Because I think it was perfectly spot on. It presents the argument on principle and as articulate a manner as I could possibly ask for. And Hillary's response demonstrates the point that I'm kind of alluding towards here. Go ahead, Hillary.
I agree that I think it's nice to keep, the local.
Nice?
Nice.
I'm agreeing with
it's
what you're
essential.
saying. I'm agreeing with what you're saying, but I think the spirit of the law, and I think that, I just said it again, but I have to say it again, the spirit of the law is to create more housing that people can afford, and therefore I think
So
if
you like
you're
the law?
gonna go forward with what you were planning before, I think I would vote yes, because I know that that's, we're saying the same thing.
So you're in favor of the law, and you're voting to opt out because, as she just mentioned right there, that Bill Taylor has essentially conceded that this is going to happen through zoning, that exactly these provisions are going to be happening through the normal zoning process anyway. So Hillary, if you're watching, so folks know, you're not in favor of opting out on principle. You're in favor of the actual legislation itself, which means why would you opt out? So what's left? And, there was 30 minutes of back and forth that I'm not editing into this video. I'm not going through and editing down to somehow whittle down to probably still 20 minutes. You guys can watch the video of yourself. It's on the town of Milford's page. The entire exchange period was centered around prying a promise from Bill Taylor to get the exact provisions into place via zoning if opted out. Again, this is irrelevant to the argument on principle. And if you don't like the legislation and are opting out because of that, you wouldn't demand a promise to get this legislation through via another method. So what's left? We know the opt-out was going to happen with the 6 Republicans in the room. We know the base finds Hartford coming down on New Milford wholly unpalatable. We know you're going to now use this as a excuse me. We know you're going to now use this as a gotcha when zoning doesn't improve the exact verbiage we opted out of. The answer is optics. This is an argument on optics. This is the argument that won over the Dems. The weakest of all arguments is the one that actually won people over. Mike's rule played out before our very eyes last Monday night. Now completely undeniable. So we talked about in the description how I wanted to get into the Route 7 accidents very briefly since we're kind of way over on time. They appear to at least be down year over year. And I guess the segue we're making here is that, the problems that are happening in the state are problems that are happening when it comes to everything the state touches, including Route 7. But it appears at least that accidents on Route 7 in Milford are down year over year. This is 23.
So I asked the chief to give us some statistics comparative year over year. So as of last year, we had 1,282 traffic accidents for the year. That equivocates to 3.5 accidents a day. So far this year, we've had 811 accidents. There's 316 days of the year so far. So that averages out to 2.56 accidents a day, which is less than last year. But because we're aware of the accidents, it makes it much more in tune. Now, is one accident too many? Absolutely.
So what he's talking about is something I've dubbed the plane crash effect, and you guys can check that out here on my YouTube channel. Again, on the side, you can see the series I have on philosophical concepts. So if you guys just go to my channel, it's Captain Phoenix, all one word. On YouTube, you guys can go on to playlists, and under playlists, it'll say philosophical concepts. This is video 5 out of 14 entitled The Plane Crash Effect, which is something along the lines of, in brief, the reason that you hear about this isn't because it's common, but in fact maybe because it's not common. It may be because of the fact that you hear the reason you hear about it as often as you do is because you hear about all of them that happen. With plane crashes, you hear about every single plane crash that happens. That's why it makes it seem like they're happening all the time, when in reality, the safest way to travel per passenger mile is by plane. Now, there's a caveat that needs to be offered with this data point that Pete's presented, and that is that this is a single year. So a single year is not a trend. You would need multiple years to develop a trend. It could be that the 2022 numbers are the anomaly. It could be that the 2021 numbers are anomaly. Now, the anomaly. Now, that said, last year was 2021, and we know that the number of miles people were driving on a regular basis, the number of passenger miles driven in 2021 was significantly down, in part because of what was happening with COVID. And as someone who lives in Willow Springs, I'm very much aware of the infamous nature that intersection and that strip that comes along with that intersection and that strip of Route 7. There should probably be a stoplight there with all the traffic going in and out of that condo complex where I live, that I go in and out of. So for those who are wondering why there isn't a stoplight there, well,
some of the things that we found out, and I've talked to the senator-elect and also our other representatives, some of the things that we are looking to do is, first of all, we've asked for an additional traffic light at Willow Springs. DOT has been very hesitant because that was supposed to have been put in by the developer. That never happened. I have explained that is a dangerous area, as we've seen by the many accidents and fatalities within that area. So we're going to continue to work with them, as well as Western Council of Governments and our state representatives, to see if we can do something.
And nothing will ever be done about it. Why? It's because Route 7 is state-owned and run. And yes, they're dealing with a schmuck developer that has a notoriety which is not good, infamy rather than fame, here in New Milford. But what that means is, because we're dealing with the state and that developer who's folded, what that means, as Chris Cosgrove explained, nothing will ever be done about that. This is why you should be demanding devolution. This is why you should be demanding consent of the governed. And that's only going to come with devolution. That's only going to come when you say, as a town, we are not going to let Hartford rule our lives. We here in New Milford know what's best for us here in New Milford. So those decisions should be being made here in New Milford. Hillary, if you're listening, this should be the entire reason for opting out of those provisions, for those zoning provisions. That and nothing else. It doesn't even matter what those provisions are. They didn't originate here. They aren't going through our process. They aren't exposed to the voters in our town. So we should be opting out. Demand devolution, demand consent. Okay, we're going to kind of branch off now here into something more. And, I always, whenever we talk about the show, I like to start local and kind of expand outward as a rule, rather than starting outward and expanding inward. And one of the things I'd really like to talk about, aside from the results themselves, is some, we'll call it stuff that has to do with the process when it comes to elections. We're on YouTube and Facebook. These are not platforms. These are publications. There are no such thing as YouTube users. There's no such thing as Facebook users. There are only contributing authors. But we're going to start with, Connecticut's 134th House District. And we're going to talk about Trump's announcement, which I shared on Facebook. And there's going to be something of a corollary. We're going to be able to meld these two topics together, sort of. So let's start off with the Connecticut 134th results. So the results in Connecticut 120 and 134th were so close that they required a state-mandated recall. Here we go. 1 vote margin heading into recount for 134th district race. This is according to Patch, Alfred Branch, Patch staff. Democrat Sarah Keat, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, leads Republican Megan McCloat, and I might be mispronouncing that too, 5,118 to 5,117, according to unofficial results from the Secretary of State's office. So this triggers, by rule, an automatic recount. Fairfield, Connecticut. The recount to determine the winner of the state's 134th House district seat is scheduled for early next week in Fairfield and Trumbull, as the race currently hangs by a 1-vote margin, according to the Secretary of State's office. By the way, what's the date on this thing? This is November 12th. The election was the 9th, right? The 8th. The 8th. So 4 days later, after we've allowed a whole bunch of mail-in votes to come in and a whole bunch of late counted mail-in votes, say from military votes to come in, it's time for a recount. So that took 4 days. 4 days to determine we needed a recount. The winner will take over the 134th district post that was held by Republican Laura Devlin, who vacated the seat to run for lieutenant governor. The unofficial numbers have changed over the past several days. At one point, McCloat, the Republican, had an edge of 5,050 votes to Kate's 5,023 votes, according to the Secretary of State's website. McCate's campaign said that after a hand count of absentee ballots, he'd had an 11-vote lead, 5,127 to 5,116. Both candidates welcomed the recount, but perhaps wearily. So the results came in, unlike Arizona, and I don't even know if I can mention the word election in Arizona in the same sentence, but as of November 26th, so it's November 16th, excuse me, so that was Wednesday of last week. So just over 8 days to count all the votes and do a manual recount. Fairfield recount gives Connecticut's House Democrats a 98th seat. Democrat Sarah Kate flips seat held by Representative Laura Devlin, who was Bob Stefanowski's running mate. A recount Wednesday gave Democrat Sarah Kate of Fairfield a 10-vote victory. 10 votes, folks, over Republican Megan McCloat in the 134th House District, flipping an open Republican seat and giving Democrats a 98 to 53 majority. Now, we're basically going to stop there, because you guys might say, well, it still didn't matter. 97 to 54 is just as bad as 98 to 53. Well, not exactly, because what that does is brings you 1 vote closer to a proper legal supermajority, to a proper veto-proof, and I know Ned Lamont's not going to veto anything that comes through the House or Senate with majorities that are that favorable to Democrats. But there are certain provisions that when you have a supermajority, especially as it relates to procedure, once you have a supermajority, which is 101 versus 98, that make it even more difficult for those 53, the minority, to have any say in anything. By the way, here in New Milford, we're represented by the 108th District, the 67th District, and the 69th District, which all went Republican. And in the case of the 67th District, went Republican in a landslide in a town with more registered Democrats than registered Republicans. Which means that we are talking about moving closer towards taxation without representation. We're moving closer to 1 vote closer towards lacking consent of the governed when you have those provisions that are going to kick in at the time of a supermajority. So there's a reason I'm bringing all of that up, which we're going to go onto YouTube. So we're going to get into your Q&A in just a minute. So get those questions in. As I mentioned before, if you want to participate as a call-in guest, hop onto the Discord channel, hop onto the Discord server. The link is right here and in this video's description, so you guys can hop in. So I'll be checking on that in just a minute. Just go into the general voice, and I'll pull you into the conversation from there. So we saw the recount, we saw the results, we saw how close that was. And there's a reason I'm bringing this up, and there's also a reason I'm going to bring up, in case that you guys haven't seen it, I've backed up this video on Odyssey. Yes, Donald Trump has officially announced his entry into the 2024 election. I haven't voted for him yet. Probably won't be voting for him in 2024. We'll see how things go. It's going to depend largely on whether or not he wins the primary, which is going to depend, I think, largely on whether or not Ron DeSantis actually runs. But that's neither here nor there, and that's not why I bring all of this up. Just for those of you who care to relive the moment, it is official. It is Donald Trump. 2 years in advance is going to be running for president in 2024.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking more about that on YouTube. So I only risk getting booted off of one publication. So before we close down on Facebook, if you guys want to hop over to YouTube, great. Link is in this video's description to join in on join in on YouTube. So all I have to do is go to the description, click on a link, and bring it over to YouTube. You go into YouTube, type in Catholic Phoenix, all one word. I should come up right there. So let's go ahead and get into your Q&A before we get into this topic, because I want this part of the video to actually get covered. I want to be able to go over your Q&A. I want to be able to actually respond to the viewers. You guys should be holding me to the fire. This is how I go about that. So before I get completely yeeted off of both Facebook and YouTube, before I shut down Facebook and get kicked off of YouTube, let's go over your Q&A. Let's see what you guys had to say. Ray's here. Ray Lillis is a regular of the show. I don't know if he's still here, but Ray, thanks for joining in. Ray is an extreme regular of the show, so it's cool to have Ray here on these conversations. No smoke and stroll ever. That's going to be tough because you're going to have to find either a sidewalk where what Randy DeBella said would apply to the sidewalk. I'm not sure where that even would be. Or you're going to have to close a roadway and do it down the roadway. And I'm pretty sure with Stip and Stroll, that's part of what they do anyways. So it's not like they shut down every road downtown, but I'm pretty sure they at least close down the crossover. So, you're still allowed to smoke weed on the road. So, Ray, my exact arrangement, obviously, and I think he means argument. My exact argument, obviously, not schools or kids' parks, but other slots, who cares? But other lots, I think he's saying, who cares? Or smoking section. Yeah, so I think he's referring to what I was talking about, how one of the ways that you could improve the ordinance, perhaps, would be to take places where I think everyone would agree, because, again, we're dealing with consent. The thing that matters, the principle is consent of the governed. There are some parks in this town where I think nobody would be on board with a total prohibition of smoking weed in those town parks. Sega Meadows is probably the one that you'd go with. Again, the one where I would say the needle would probably where the line would be drawn would be, Lynn Deming Park. I think the people that are okay with it being in Lynn Deming Park are okay with it pretty much everywhere. And I think the people that are not okay with it being in Lynn Deming Park, that's going to be your dividing line, right? Would you be okay with it in Lynn Deming Park? So guys, let me know in the comment section. And it looks like that's all the commentary we've got on Facebook. Let me see if there's anything on YouTube. And there isn't on YouTube. So we're going to shut down on Facebook, especially to Ray, who has been the most the most regular of our live viewers. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I do this for you guys. Of course, I don't do it for money right now. It'd be nice to be able to just do this for a living, but hey, that's where we are right now. Again, I do it for you. I do it because, these are conversations that in certain places decorum dictates that you're not that you shouldn't be talking the way I do, in common parlance, in the way and manner I do. So I do this for you guys, and you guys that are watching. Again, I always want to make sure that everybody understands how grateful I am that you guys are here to watch all of this, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Hopefully next week, like we always do, our regularly scheduled time, Sunday night at 7. Top onto YouTube if you want to hang out for that part of the conversation. Otherwise, we're shutting down on Facebook. And for those who are watching on Facebook, night, everybody. Okay, it looks like we have shut down on Facebook, excuse me. Leslie says, thanks, Mike. Leslie is another regular viewer. So, Leslie, I don't know if you managed to make it over here to YouTube, but totally appreciate it. Do it for you guys. So the conversation that I want to expand upon, if you guys allow me, since we're running way over time. Oh, no, I'm out of water, so never mind. I was going to take a swig of water. So I'll try to be brief on this matter, especially because I really don't want to get kicked off YouTube, so I'm not going to say the most clickbaity of things, if you will. But you guys saw how narrow the result was in Connecticut's 134th. After a recount, the Democrat won by 10 votes. And it looks like it's probably going to wind up being more like 12 or 13. But out of over almost 11,000 votes cast, you won by 10, 12 votes. That's an incredibly narrow margin. And I'm not complaining about the margin itself. I'm not saying that if it were a Republican, I wouldn't have this complaint. Because the complaint isn't that the Democrat won. But, the Democrat did win, so it's time to be introspective here if you're a Republican. There's a reason that I'm bringing this up. And there's a reason that I showed you that clip from Donald Trump, and they kind of blend together with how narrow that vote was and how close the result was in Connecticut's 134th. And now it's also going to bleed into why it is that I voted not to amend the Connecticut Constitution to allow for early voting, which, do I have that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we talked about that on election night, I think this was. Yes, and I separated out that video so you guys can see that why it is that I voted no on the ballot question and took the L. This result was 60-40 in favor of amending the Constitution to permit the General Assembly to provide for early voting. And I went into great detail in that video as to my reservations for amending the Constitution. Namely that we don't have the bill in front of us. We don't have the legislation in front of us. That we're talking about the reason the Connecticut is called the Constitution State is because we've got the oldest constitution in the country. It long predates the Revolution. And it's held up that long. So if we're going to be talking about changing a chartering document that's that old and that's survived that long with hardly any revision, this should be something that's mandatory. And we talked about in that video how this is obviously not something that absolutely has to be done. So, and the place where there is a window for, and I have to say the word, fraud or general electioneering is in things like early voting and mail-in voting. Now, early voting is not nearly as bad in terms of its exposure to risk as the potential exposure to risk that mail-in voting comes with it. And here in Connecticut, the laws and oversight when it comes to mail-in ballots are extremely lax. And this is why I don't want to expand, generally speaking, into the area of voting is a privilege, not a right. It's not a right. Vladimir Putin is not allowed to come to the state of Connecticut and cast a vote for Bob Stefanowski. It's illegal. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason nobody wants that to be the case. There's a reason infants aren't allowed to vote. Right? And that's because voting is a privilege, not a right. And I don't want to be broadly making the statement that we're moving into the area of voting is a right. It's not. It's not. And that's why, and that's, so you guys can check that video out to see exactly what it is, and I expand on that in great detail. It's about 15 minutes long, so it's not going to take you too long. As to why it is that I voted no. And yes, I did take an L. Now, I told you that story so I could tell you this story. And this is my story from 2013 to 2016, roughly. When I was voting in 2013 to 2016, I lived at a different address. I lived on Taylor Terrace in New Milford, and I voted in East Street School, right? And I should have probably brought up an example. The voter rolls are sheets of paper that fold over, and they're not front to back. They're folded over. So it's like, imagine two sheets of paper, and as you flip over the voter rolls, you can flip through the pages to see who's on the rolls and who is a qualified elector. In 2013 was the first time I saw, it was either 2013 or 14. It was the first time that I saw my entry for my name on the voter rolls, because the lady that was working the polling station asked me my name, asked me my address, and she was just flying through that paper. And what you'll see is that it's everything's laid out horizontally. You'll have your name and then your address, and then you'll have a strike through, right? Not through the whole thing, but just through the middle here. And the kind ladies that work these polls, they just kind of flip through and they just look for those lines and don't really read, the names and the addresses with absolute alacrity at every step of the way. Again, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages with thousands of names. Why would you be that? Why would you subject yourself to that, right? So At the bottom of the page was my name and then my address. And then directly underneath that was my name and my address. No difference between the two. What's wild is when you flip the page to the next page, at the top of the page, again, fold it over, right? So it's attached, right? It's my name, my address. And the only reason we caught the second page is because I happened, by pure chance, to catch the double entry of my name at the bottom of that first page. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. Why are there two entries here? And they said, oh, that must just be a clerical error. I didn't even see it until you pointed it out. I was like, well, wait a minute. Flip over the page. Let's see if I'm on there as well. Again. And sure enough, there I was. 3 entries for my name. Which means that these ladies who don't really check things that thoroughly, I could have been the one that was like, could you please just cross off both my names on this page? I could have gone there at 6 o'clock in the morning, cast a vote, gone there at 6 o'clock in the evening, when it's an entirely new crew. Nobody knows who, when I voted. They flip over to the next page and they see my name with no cross out with it, because they're not really going to be that thorough. They're going to see an entire page of cross-offs, and then they're going to say, screw it, next page. Bam, there I am at the top. Which means that for something like 4 years, it was a dogged effort that I was putting in to getting this fixed over at the office of the registrar, which here in New Milford's only open 2 hours a week. And this was something that because of how the state processes these things on the back end took years to resolve. And in fact, it was only resolved, as far as I know, in 2018, my last full year in New Milford before I moved to Tennessee for a year. So it took that long to get that issue resolved. And what I could have done was I could have voted twice. In every one of those elections, no one would have ever been the wiser. What's crazy is because there was no driver's license involved. Connecticut, at least at the time, didn't require photo ID. And so what I could have done is, and again, nobody would have asked for it. So I could have had a friend that looked like me, just who knew my information, because people didn't really know me back then, go in and vote for me. I could have had my brother steal my vote because he knew my statistics. He knew where I lived. He could have seen the multiple entries and been like, yeah, well, I forgot to register to vote this year, so I'm going to vote on Mike's name. And then I would have lost that vote. And by the way, why wouldn't that happen if you're not presenting ID in the first place? Now, here's the crazy part. Because there's also extremely lax mail-in ballot. Now, I had to mail in 1 year. I was going to be out of town 1 year. I knew in advance I was going to be out of town. So something like a month or so in advance, I sent in my mail-in ballot because I had to. Because there's no way for me to make it. I was going to be way, way out of town on election day. But multiple states away. There was no getting out of it. It was for work. So because there was extremely lax laws about the submission of those ballots, what I could have done, since on the back end, at most, one name would have been pulled, is requested a mail-in ballot, voted in the morning at the polling station, gone to the drop-off box and dropped off my mail-in ballot on that day, because they accept day of mail-in ballot submissions at the drop-off location, where there's no human being operating there. It's just a box, and you slide it into the box, and the town clerk every few hours comes down and empties the box. And then in the afternoon, voted again. So I could have voted 3 times. And here's what's wild. Here's what's even worse. My current Connecticut driver's license has that old address on it. Now, I went to my voting location, which is a different voting location because I've moved. I've changed address in town. But the state of Connecticut does not issue. It doesn't even require. It just doesn't reissue driver's licenses if you move and change address in the same town. So I'd go so far as to, I'd bet anything. I would bet anything. I'll be doing this. I'll be checking this next year. I would bet anything because of how bad the state is on the back end of handling the clerical and administrative end of this. I would bet anything that my name is still in that East Street School location. It's still on that voter roll. I guarantee it still is. And if they ask for my driver's license I'm going to show them a driver's license. And if they look at the address, it's going to have the old address on it because Connecticut doesn't reissue driver's licenses for changes of address in the same town. I could have, back then, cheated my way into 3 votes. This year, I could, without really doing anything necessarily that nefarious other than going to the polling station and voting twice, going to 2 different polling stations, I could probably cast 2 votes. And in an election as close as the 134th, it might swing a district like that. And now I'm not saying that that happened. I'm not going to say that it even might have happened. What I'm saying is that the possibility exists for somebody to act in such a nefarious manner. I understand that doing this on a coordinated manner in large scale is incredibly difficult. But when it comes to something like a House seat, all it takes is a handful of people in these incredibly closely decided elections to alter the result of that election in a fraudulent manner. So that's all it would take, which speaks to how important the integrity of the election is. This is why those provisions should be in place to ensure that there is that integrity, so that we don't have a situation where there's even a question to be asked. So we don't have a situation where in the 134th, it's really, really close. And did anybody cheat? Did anybody? I mean, the answer is probably no in a district like that. But the question is a valid question when you don't have an answer of, well, no, we went through these extraordinary lengths and have these already extant extraordinary provisions to ensure that that's the case. Now, we talked about earlier in the show, consent of the governed. This is, you have to have the assurance of the integrity of these votes if you're going to have consent of the governed. How do you know that the majority population want Pete Bass to be our mayor? How do you know that? If it was a 1-vote decision and Mike Sennello's name is on the ballot twice at 2 different polling locations, which is going to make it near impossible to oversee. It's going to make it near impossible to prevent Mike unless he's an altruistic good dude. It's going to be near impossible to prevent him from fraudulently casting a second vote at another polling location. It wouldn't take much. It's not ballot harvesting. It's just me going to one location, voting, and going to another location and voting. Because you don't have this clerical oversight. And again, I don't know how you would go about doing that with the system that we have right now. But the place where you have serious concerns with that, the place where it would be even easier would be through mail-in voting. Where in the case of something like voting in person, how do you have voter intimidation at the station? How do you have voter intimidation at the location? Again, this is a matter of consent. How do you know that that's actually who they were voting for if they had a gun to their head? There's a great argument that that's not who they voted for. It's who the gun voted for in that case. Which is why, the Iraqi elections that were 99.9% in favor of the previous dictator who was murdering his own citizens and was gloating about it, right? Saddam Hussein was a quote-unquote elected leader who won with like 99.9% majorities. When you have a mail-in situation, how do you preclude that? When you have an in-person situation, how do you preclude that? In an in-person situation, if somebody went in and was intimidating somebody to vote a certain way, it would be painfully obvious to multiple people in the room and probably also the security officer who's there to ensure that things like that don't happen. How do you do that in the home? How do you ensure that when it's all mail-in, one patriarch or one matriarch isn't intimidating their barely 18-year-old kids into voting a certain way? You're going to vote for the Republican or you're going to find a new apartment. You're going to vote for the Democrat or I'm cutting off your allowance. What do you do about that? And the thing is, how would they even do that? How would they even enforce that with an in-person vote? You're sitting in the car. All right, son, when we go in there, you're going to vote Republican. How do you know he voted Republican? How could dad possibly know I voted Republican? How could Dad possibly know I voted Republican if we're doing mail-in situation? Because we're sitting down at the dinner table and he's going to be staring at my ballot as I'm filling it out. Straightforward. I'm not saying this happens. I'm not saying this happened. But there is the potential for that to take place in a mail-in situation that isn't there when you're voting in person. And this is especially true when it comes time for mom and dad to physically hand in the vote. Because let's say you vote via mail-in ballot surreptitiously. So your father doesn't know who you voted for. If your father's the one handing in the ballot, man, it is going to be really hard to hide that from him. It's going to be really hard to hide from mom and dad who you voted for. If mom and dad are the overbearing matriarch or patriarch that demands their barely 18-year-old, Irish twins, vote a certain way. And this is especially true of fraternities where even in Arizona, which I cannot believe allows this. I don't know if this is the case in Connecticut, but apparently Arizona, at places like Arizona State, right? Allow members of fraternities to submit batches of mail-in ballots from their fraternity. And you're going to tell me there's no hazing or intimidation happening at fraternities at Arizona State University? Again, I understand that this is something that this type of thing would be something that's very hard to do in scale, but this is absolutely the origin of the skepticism regarding mail-in ballots and mail-in voting. And yet what we're seeing, what we saw throughout the entire campaign from 2020 and here locally throughout the entire campaign in 2021 was Democrats living and dying in mail-in voting. And in fact, to such an extent that things like Johanna Hayes' Connecticut Fits, Johanna Hayes' ads wouldn't end with vote for Hayes. It would be pick up your mail-in ballot today. So they're not even pushing for the vote. They're pushing for the mail-in ballot. And I think there's a reason why. There has to be a reason why they're not saying vote for my guy. They're saying pick up your mail-in ballot. Why would they specify that thing? There has to be a reason that they're doing that. This is something that didn't take place for hundreds of years in this type of advertising. Something changed, which means it was a decision that they had to make. And if you allow me to don the tinfoil hat for just a hot minute, I think the reason that this is the case is because Democrats are purposely undermining election integrity, or at least the perception thereof, because they know they can gaslight the Republican response and run on that. Remember, we went over this. We beat this to a dead horse. We showed the evidence. I have a Google Doc on that's available to everyone on my Facebook page. You can just go on and we have the evidence. The DTC in town have labeled the Republicans as evil and want to destroy, quote, our democracy. And yeah, I know. Anyone who says the words our democracy, red flag. Instant red flag, right? And then when measures are being at least tried to be put in place to bring back at least the perception of integrity, you can guarantee they won't be. And if anything, right? So when the Republicans propose these measures, you can guarantee they won't get passed. And if anything, you can, in doing so, make elections even less secure. They've already intimated their desire to have things like illegal immigrants vote because voting is a right. Why shouldn't Vladimir Putin vote? The goal is to expand who is voting and to their favor, because they believe that expanding who is voting to and treating it as a right is going to be, in terms of electioneering, if you will, to their favor. It's not a right. It's a privilege. Voting is a privilege. And because of the insanity of the Democrats, I'm 100% on board with making it harder to vote in general and with demanding skin in the proverbial game. Vladimir Putin should not be allowed or able to vote in the U.S. And just because he didn't do it today doesn't mean he won't try it in the future. And it doesn't have to be Putin himself. Voting is a privilege, not a right. And if anything, you should be restricting the number of people who actually vote, not expanding off into the ether indefinitely into the space of it's a right. But if you do that, then you're going to wind up capturing those people who you can then turn to and say, well, the right wing is crazy. They don't want you to vote. They're the ones who are trying to destroy our democracy by having you not be allowed to vote. And it's your right to vote, even if you are Vladimir Putin. So, anyways, that's my tinfoil hat for the week, if you will. That I think that the reason that this is the case is to undermine the integrity, is to get Republicans to think they're being cheated, even if they aren't, so that they'll either stay home at the ballot or so that they can then use that to gaslight the Republican response to, well, wait a minute, why are we expanding this? Why are we making it easier? Let me know what you guys think. I don't know if I just got kicked. I probably did get kicked. Let's see if we're still on YouTube. Oh, we are still on YouTube. Well, how about that? I wonder how long they'll be. I'll probably have to section off this when I go and editing. I'm recording locally too, and what I'll probably have to do is trim this off of YouTube and just put a little logo on there that says, "Sorry guys, we can't have this on YouTube." I'll back this all up on Odyssey anyways, just to be sure. So, anyways, thanks everybody for staying tuned. Hope you guys have enjoyed. We're hitting the 2-hour mark. My throat's worn out. We're all done. We'll see you guys next week. Good night, everybody.